Great. It's starting to record. You can go ahead.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to week 2 of the EI webinar. I hope you guys have all had a fantastic 2 weeks. We've had Easter, I believe, and then we had Workers' Day. I can't remember now if Easter was already past when we talked, but I hope you all have got some good rest and are looking forward to this conversation on the history of Africa's development, which is a conversation I'm really, really excited about, because I think that the context of where Africa is, where we started, how we've gotten to where we've gotten, all the questions around aid and capital, and social progress versus economic progress. I think there's such important questions for entrepreneurs to be grappling with, I think not only at an anecdotal level, but really at a scientific level, which is what a lot of what we're talking about today is. So I'm really excited to have this conversation, and of course, even more excited that Dr. Nkosana Moyo is joining us. So, you know, I hope that you've all had a chance to watch the material, because the wonderful thing, of course, is that what we're trying to do, Khotso, Daniel, myself, is to see how many of these people you're actually watching or reading that we can bring into these conversations. And today we were able to bring Nkosana, so that's really fantastic. He'll be joining us at 7. He said he may run a little bit late because there's a medical issue in the family, but he's likely to be on time, he said, and he's quite a timely person, so if he's late, there will be a reason, but he will be here likely at 7 p.m. and then he will take us through his thinking on the development of Africa. And I can't think of a better person. I mean, as you would all know, Nkosana was at some point the vice president of the African Development Bank. He was also the Minister of Information and something else, and I can't remember, in Zimbabwe. He's now the founder and the chairman of the Mandela Institute for Development Studies. He also worked in the private sector for some years, in the banking space, private equity space specifically. So he's traveled, I don't know an African country that Nkosana has not been to, and not just to visit, but to actually do work that is about Africa's development. So I cannot think of a better person to guide us in this conversation. So if you haven't experienced the magic of Nkosana Moyo, you're about to. I think he's fabulous. But thank you all for coming and for joining. And as I like to start things, I think let's all do a quick check-in. And by quick, I literally mean 30 seconds, because this is the highest sign up we've had for this talk. So Khotso, that's a sign. We should bring speakers. People are not interested in me, they're interested in speakers. So that's the lesson, that's a big lesson. So it's perfectly fine. So let's do a quick check-in, just 10 seconds, even if you can keep it at that, which is to say, what are you really excited about this conversation today? So your name and what are you excited about? And let's do that really, really, really quickly.
Sure. And just before, can I quickly interrupt you? So just 2 things, Rachel. This is Khotso speaking, by the way, the teaching assistant, fellow in residence, and the teaching assistant for the EI course. So I just thought we could do 2 things before that. So just one is, if you don't mind, just quickly giving us a background of who you are, Rachel, because some of us would have experienced you when you were still with Alan Gray, but some of us might not be familiar. And then the second thing is, some people actually haven't signed up for the EI course, so this is the first time they're interacting with the content, so they haven't seen the links. So I think it might be worth even just me doing a 2-minute overview of what the course is about, and just showing them the link online.
So do you want to do the overview first, Khotso, and then I can do the introduction, which will lead us to the others introducing themselves.
Sure thing. I'll quickly do that. And then I think at the point when we do the check-in, so we've got 12 participants. So you can decide what number, if we go for all 12 or 5, or what makes sense. Cool.
Okay.
Sure. So thank you so much for joining. As I mentioned, my name is Khotso. I'm a fellow in residence, and uh, I'm also the teaching assistant for the EI course, helping Rachel out. So if ever you have questions or you want to sign up for the course, please just pop me an email. So I want to quickly show you, well, first of all, just tell you what EI is and why we created the course. So as you know, the Alan Gray Orbis Ventures portfolio, just before I do that, I just want to make sure, can most of you hear me? If there's anyone who can't hear me, please put up your hand. So there should be a raise hand button somewhere nearby. So if 4 or 5 people can't hear me, then I know there might be a challenge. I just want to get a sense. I'll wait for 3
So
seconds.
you might have to type that out, Khotso, because if they can't hear you, then they
Oh, sure. I'm gonna
yeah,
quickly
so
type
maybe
it.
type it out as well.
If anyone not hear me, please raise your hand. Super. I sent that to the group.
Great.
So the ventures portfolio is all about helping fellows to start businesses in areas that they're passionate about. And so there's basically 4 programs. One is the ideation program, which is what EI is about, basically to help you explore the business context, explore what you're passionate about, explore what Africa is about, so that you could come up with an idea that can be operationalized in a high impact venture. And then the following programs after EI is the creation, validation, um, and the acceleration program, which is basically you taking this idea and testing it in the market, then developing a product, and then at the acceleration stage, you're basically growing your initial market base. So all of those are 3 different programs. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but if you are at the point where you want to start developing a product, please pop me an email. In fact, not even developing a product. You've got the idea, but you want to start exploring how to make that happen and how to validate if customers really want this. Let me know, and then we'll figure out a way to support you. We've got 3 different programs, as mentioned. So I want to quickly show you what the EI course online looks like. For some of you who haven't seen the links, I'll be super quick. So I'm going to quickly share my screen. Let's see, sharing, show screen. Great, Rachel, can you see my screen?
Yes, I can.
Okay, cool, super. So the EI is basically a 4-month course with 8 different modules talking about different topics about Africa, about what it means to create a product that's supposed to improve the lives of people. So the link is here. I'm going to quickly post it on the group chat so that if any of you want to quickly look, you can just sign on. So every 2 weeks we will have a class, and before the class you're expected to do about 1 to 2 hours worth of preparation. So you would have seen that this week there were 3 different videos to watch. One featuring Nkosana Moyo himself, who's going to be the guest speaker today, and a few others. And once you go through the content, the following week we basically discuss in a session such as this. And what we're hoping to do is to have a guest speaker come through every now and then for a few sessions, depending on who we can get. So I think that's basically it. And then just the last thing is there's also online discussions that we hope you will be able to participate in. So you'll see these here, the specific questions, and then of course you can give us feedback on how to improve the course. That's basically it on my side regarding EI. Oh, and just by the way, just pop me an email if you want me to send you the link again. Yeah, and then you can enroll. Anyone is free to enroll at any point in time. Super.
Great, thank you.
Rachel.
Thank you for that. That's very useful. And I just want to reiterate on Khotso's point, please make sure that you read the content, you watch the videos. it's really so educational. I mean, I have literally been having all sorts of epiphanies today and over the last week thinking about this content and things I didn't even know that are so fascinating. So please make sure you look at the material that has been so well curated by Khotso and Daniel. And thank you for that, Khotso. So my name is Rachel Nyaradzo Adams. For those of you who don't know me, I used to be a very long time ago the regional manager for Gauteng for the Alan Gray Orbis Foundation. So I used to work with Wits and University of Pretoria and University of Johannesburg, which is where Khotso and I first met actually, when I was coaching him during the time that he was a fellow. And so it feels like quite a legacy thing that we are now all back together again somewhere, somehow, having this conversation. I think it speaks very powerfully to what a network like this one can achieve over the years. And I hope you're all leveraging that network. When I left Alan Gray, I moved on to McKinsey, where I was responsible for developing, implementing, and managing the McKinsey Leadership Program, which is a program to accelerate the leadership development of select talent at the organization. I left McKinsey, then joined Yale University, where I was the Associate Director for Africa. So I was responsible for developing an Africa strategy for Yale University because, you know, Yale was slightly behind other universities and were very interested as to how they could catch up. And so I was invited to come and help them design that process. And then I quit Yale to come back to Zimbabwe 2 years ago to start my own leadership institute called Narachi Leadership, and essentially, not institute, I don't call it an institute. It's a leadership consultancy. What I basically do is I help leaders reach their best leadership, essentially through training, through coaching, through advisory, and basically trying to, as I say on my website, deepen the benches of leadership across Africa. So, and I work in various African countries doing this work. So basically that's me in a nutshell. What I am really excited about, and I guess I can kick us off, and when you tell us what you're excited about, let me please encourage you to take from the readings, because I think the videos, this week it was just videos, to take from the videos, because we want to have an educated conversation about some of the stuff that we've seen. If you haven't been able to look at the material, then you can sort of veer off that course, but let's stay true to that. And before I share, by the way, Khotso, I forgot to say this to you. Actually, no, don't worry, I'll send you a message. So basically, I am very excited to look at, in Hans' video, Hans Rosling, he talks about this fact that he feels that in the last 50 years, African countries have been the most impressive in terms of growth and development. And I sort of wondered, was he saying that from a lens of a Westerner who's pitying Africa, or does he really believe that even though we are at the stage of Europe 100 years ago today, we have made the best progress over the last 50 years in the world? That really intrigued me, and I'd love to have a conversation about that. So we can go to the next person. And Nkosana is calling me, so I'm just going to mute myself for a second. Khotso, can we go to the next person? Hello?
Hi, Rachel. Sorry, some fellows just walked into the office, so I was a bit distracted, just setting them up.
Okay. I said, please, can you? So we were waiting for you to get the others to speak, because I'm done.
Oh, sure. Okay, cool. So I'm gonna unmute. Maybe what we could do is, so whoever wants to speak, please just raise your hand. There's a raise hand button, and then I will unmute you, just to make it easier administratively. So maybe let's start with Katie. Katie, do you mind just raising your hand, just so we can hear a voice? There's Katie. Let me unmute.
Sorry, Khotso, I'm just going to mute myself quickly. Nkosana is calling me, so let me just hear what he's trying to say.
Sure.
Okay.
Sure. Hi, Katie. You can unmute yourself and then say something.
Sorry, can you hear me? Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, I
Hello?
can hear you.
Oh,
Go
okay.
ahead, Katie. Sorry about
Yeah,
that.
so I haven't signed up or anything yet. I actually wasn't available today, but then I became available, so I thought, no, let me join. So I haven't read the material, but I'm really quite keen just to hear about the African history from Africans, because I think as much as there's content from Africans that feed into African history, a lot of it is also quite it's structured in such a way that we see it from, if you want to say, like the westernized world. So I'm quite keen for that.
Awesome. Thank you.
Hi, Katie.
Anybody? So Nkopeleng's got her hand up. I'm gonna quickly. All right, Nkopeleng, you've been unmuted.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Hello. Okay, cool. Yeah, I also haven't necessarily gone through the.
Have we lost?
So Nkopeleng, sorry, I muted you by accident. Sorry, go ahead. Nkopeleng, you can unmute and then go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
Okay, cool. No worries. Yeah, but what I was gonna say is that what's interesting to me is the fact that every single time we talk about Africa Rising or some sort of, development that's happening in the continent, what surprises me is that, funny enough, you still have a very colonial mentality about it, in the sense that if you look at all the industries where there's actually a lot of activity, if you look at like maybe the art world, or you look at like fishing, or you look at textile, whatever it is, you still find that wherever the story of Africa Rising is popping up, you still have quite a lot of foreign nationals who are extracting that wealth. And for me, that's surprising. It's like, I don't know if maybe we as Africans don't know about the opportunities that are there in other countries that we can tap into, or whether it's an issue of like resources, the fact that you don't have enough money to just go to Kenya and set up like a consulting firm or whatever. Yeah, so just sort of that look at growth, development, Africa, and still extraction.
Great. Thank you so much, Nkopeleng. Can I just ask that we try to keep it really short, because there's quite a number of us on the call today. So could keep it as snippy as possible. But thank you for that. That's really useful.
Sure. Could we get some more hands to be raised? Just so I can unmute that specific person. Okay. Hey, Lowell, you can go ahead, Lowell Spa.
Hey guys, it's Lowell. I know a couple of you guys, but I don't think everybody. Yeah, I'm just looking forward to listening to something different and seeing what people are talking about, because I feel like I've been out of the loop in a lot of ways for quite a while. So, yeah, and I'm also going through the same sort of process that, through the entrepreneurial induction. So yeah, stoked. Let's see how it goes. I'm keen. And thank you for making it happen.
Thanks, Lowell. Did you have a chance to go through the material at all?
No, unfortunately not. I literally looked at it today, the stuff, and I wasn't sure exactly which one, and didn't get to do it, unfortunately. Sorry, next week.
Okay. All right, thank you.
So, Rachel, I was thinking how about we take, say, 3 or 4 more hands,
Sure.
and then start to ask a few important questions related to the material, and then
Great.
Dr. Moyo will probably join in 10 minutes. He might be late, but we'll just continue if he hasn't joined yet.
And on that point, Khotso, he's just called me to say he is on his way back home, and he hopes to be making it just slightly after 7. So he's going to be slightly late, like I said earlier. But he will be. He will be here. They're stuck. He's in London, and they're stuck in traffic. So.
Okay. Super. Anybody else with their hand up? And then Nkopeleng and Lowell, if you don't mind lowering your hand. Oh, here's Tom.
Hey everyone.
Go ahead.
Hey. So yeah, I watched the Dr. Moyo's video, and I was struck by his point on leadership, where in his opinion he feels that leaders who kind of put themselves forward and campaign for themselves are not. It kind of produces the characteristics that you don't really want in a leader. You'd rather want people to suggest that this person should be a leader and then have that person be elected. So I'm looking forward to him unpacking that and maybe just discussing points around what would that system look like on a national level rather than just a small community leader. Cool, that's all.
That's great. That question blew my mind too, as you saw in the interview. When he talked about that, I was like, wow, what does that mean? So yeah, okay.
Could we get some more hands? Great. Kihisha. Go ahead, Kihisha.
Hi, it's Kihisha here. I'm here with Marco. So I haven't watched the videos, but I have a very biased interest in Dr. Moyo because I would love to work for the African Development Bank one day.
Very sneaky. Good for you.
Exactly. So Rachel, like right there, hands on. I think I'm very interested in finding out, the role of capitalism in an African context instead of capitalism from the Europeans invading African resources. I'm interested to find out if there is hope in capitalism becoming something sustainable for Africa, because I haven't totally discarded the idea yet. So hopefully it comes up. If it doesn't, I'll be keen to ask. Thank you guys for organizing. Super awesome.
Great. Thank you, Kihisha. That's fantastic.
Sure. Could we get some more hands? And Kihisha, you can lower your hand so long. Thanks for that. And also, I see that we've got people sort of going on and offline. So it's probably an internet issue. One thing you could do, it's not ideal, but you can switch the video off, since that usually consumes more data. Just means you won't get to see Rachel and Dr. Nkosana Moyo's face. Any other?
2 more people, just so we can get a sense of how we should drive the conversation. That's why this part is important.
Could we have 2 more hands? I'm not seeing any hands, so Oh, here's Tom. He's got a quick. I think he's got a question. I'm gonna unmute him, and then after that, I'd like to give someone else a chance who hasn't spoken.
Yeah. Or we can
Go ahead,
continue.
Sure.
Hey, sorry, no, just if no one else wants to talk, then I'll just add one more question or one more thing to maybe talk around is the question of aid. I know in Dr Moyo's talk, she was talking a lot about how aid can not only kind of help, but it can also hinder development. And I wonder if Dr. Moyo has any opinions on aid.
Okay. Great, thank you, Tom.
One more hand. Anyone? Okay. I don't think there are any more hands at this stage. So I think, Rachel, we could start framing the critical questions. And I'm going to disappear for 1 minute, if you don't mind. There's some fellows in the room here at the Allen Gray office that need to be connected to Wi-Fi. So I'll be back in a minute to help out.
Okay, sure. So, but I'm going to ask a question. So how do we get people to speak when you're gone?
Oh, or maybe if you don't mind talking on any specific point, I just need to disappear for 30 seconds.
Oh, okay, cool.
Seconds. Sure. And then,
okay.
Yeah, I just want to
talk a lot.
Okay, sure.
Okay. Thanks,
oh, no, it's fine. I was going to suggest that cool 4-minute video, the Hans.
Well, yes, you want to play that then, and then you can disappear for 4 minutes.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so share your screen with us and play it. So while Jose is setting it up, guys, one of the people that we had as the videos to watch was Professor Hans Rosling, who's a Swedish professor, and essentially he does sort of these big trends and numbers and data, etc. And he died actually at the beginning of this year, but he has this fantastic tool that he uses to basically show how countries have developed over the years, starting in the 1800s all the way to now. And he's got a 4-minute video that he did with the BBC that I think really is a great summary of the argument that he makes about not just Africa's, but the world's general trajectory of development. So Khotso, when you're ready, you can just play that for us, given a number of people didn't watch the content, and I think it's a good place to start to have the conversation.
Quickly share my screen. Sorry about that initial noise. Share screen. Let me know if you can see my screen, folks.
Not yet. Okay.
Loading. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. I'm gonna press play.
Visualization is right at the heart of my own work too. I teach global health.
Put some volume.
Not enough. I have to show it in ways people both enjoy and understand. Now, I'm going to try something I've never done before. Animating the data in real space, with a bit of technical assistance from the crew. So, here we go. First, an axis for health. Life expectancy, from 25 years to 75 years. And down here, an axis for wealth, income per person, $400, $4,000, and $40,000. So down here is poor and sick, and up here is rich and healthy. Now, I'm going to show you the world 200 years ago, in 1810. Here come all the countries. Europe brown, Asia red, Middle East green, Africa south of Sahara blue, and the Americas yellow. And the size of the country bubbles show the size of the population. And in 1810, it was pretty crowded down there, wasn't it? All countries were sick and poor. Life expectancy were below 40 in all countries. And only the UK and the Netherlands were slightly better off, but not much. And now, why start the world? The Industrial Revolution makes countries in Europe and elsewhere move away from the rest. But the colonized countries in Asia and Africa, they are stuck down there. And eventually, the Western countries get healthier and healthier. And now we slow down to show the impact of the First World War and the Spanish flu epidemic. What a catastrophe. And now I speed up through the 1920s and the 1930s. And in spite of the Great Depression, Western countries forge on towards greater wealth and health. Japan and some others try to follow, but most countries stay down here. Now, after the tragedies of the Second World War, we stop a bit to look at the world in 1948. 1948 was a great year. The war was over, Sweden topped the medal table at the Winter Olympics, and I was born. But the differences between the countries of the world was wider than ever. United States was in the front, Japan was catching up. Brazil was way behind, Iran was getting a little richer from oil, but still had short lives. And the Asian giants, China, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Indonesia, they were still poor and sick down here. But look what is about to happen. Here we go again. In my lifetime, former colonies gained independence, and then finally they started to get healthier and healthier and healthier. And in the 1970s, then countries in Asia and Latin America started to catch up with the Western countries. They became the emerging economies. Some in Africa follows. Some Africans were stuck in civil war and others hit by HIV. And now we can see the world today in the most up-to-date statistics. Most people today live in the middle, but there are huge differences at the same time between the best of countries and the worst of countries. And there are also huge inequalities within countries. These bubbles show country averages, but I can split them. Take China, I can split it into provinces. There goes Shanghai. It has the same wealth and health as Italy today. And there is the poor inland province Guizhou. It is like Pakistan. And if I split it further, the rural parts are like Ghana in Africa.
And yet, despite the enormous disparities today, we have seen 200 years of remarkable progress. That huge historical gap between the West and the rest is now closing. We have become an entirely new converging world. And I see a clear trend into the future with aid, trade, green technology and peace. It's fully possible that everyone can make it to the healthy, wealthy corner.
Well, what you have seen in the last few minutes is a story of 200 countries shown over 200 years and beyond. It involved plotting of 120,000 numbers. Pretty neat, huh?
Okay, great. Thank you, Khotso. Are you back, Khotso?
Oh, yes, I'm back. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for that. And I actually think that that's a great place to start, because already for me, that video raises some interesting, I think, and questionable data, but also I think is a good place to start. I mean, the picture was a bit slow on my end. I don't know if it was the same for everyone, but the blue dots were the African countries. So you'll notice that the African countries are the lagging ones, bar, I think, South Africa and a few others that are sort of somewhere in the middle, but still with a lower life expectancy and less healthy. But, you know, it's an interesting story, and I think let's open it starting from there. What were your thoughts watching this video? I mean, what came up for you both intuitively, but even just from a historical or data perspective?
So folks, if you don't mind raising your hand, and then I will unmute you so that you can share your perspective. And let's just keep it as brief as possible. Any specific hands to be raised? Okay, Lowell raised their hand. All right, Lowell, you can go ahead.
Hey, seems like no one's really keen to talk. I don't know. I think that, I mean, he interpreted it quite positively, but I don't know, like, how realistically, actually. I mean, I think, like, he just sort of brushed over the fact that even though the trend is, like, towards positive, the inequality gap itself, like, between, like, in actual people is still, like, getting bigger. So I don't know. I felt like it's still quite a narrow perspective of looking at the world and looking at, like, what we think we need to strive for and how to get there. I don't know. I mean, but obviously that's what stats is. Sorry, I'll stop now.
That's interesting, Lowell, and I think it speaks to the point that was raised earlier by Nkopeleng when she was talking about the Africa Rising story. It sounds like he's also taken that version of, you know, things are actually going well and the world is improving and let me show you how, and we're all getting towards this thing. But, you know, you do notice that point where he breaks up, is it China that he breaks up into regions, and he says, you know, you then start to see the big inequalities. You know, this part of China, I think, is actually more like Italy, whereas this part is more like Pakistan, and this part is even more like Ghana, which was, I think, a sort of, and then he sort of rushed past the point. But it's an interesting point that you raise, absolutely. Do these narratives actually help us, or do they give us false hope? I think is an interesting question. Who else? And let's do quick thinking, guys, so we can all get engaged, because otherwise there'll be three of us talking, and then you'll not have such a good time.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sure. I guess with health and life expectancy, that's a little bit more objective, so you can't exactly argue with that. Like, the numbers show what they show. But I'm always interested in how narrow the definition of developing is, you know, because if you look at, like, quality of life for certain people, you might actually find that even in South Africa, actually, some people in the rural areas have a far better quality of life compared to someone who's living in, like, Jersey CBD. But when you looking at statistics and urbanization and all of that, obviously the conclusion that you're going to draw is that, well, more people are moving into the city, they have jobs and all of that, and therefore their life is better. But that's not necessarily always the case.
Great. So how do we measure progress? And in fact, you know, Khotso and I were talking about this earlier. One of the things he says in the bigger video that we shared in the content is he talks about the fact that social progress, that developing countries are focusing a lot more on social progress than they should on economic progress, and that it's hard to actually achieve the two in tandem. So you'll notice even with this thing that he was doing now, that the healthier countries get, the wealthier they become. And I think it's a fascinating question for entrepreneurs as well, which kind of goes against what we discussed last week, which is, you know, focus more on the innovation than the poverty issues. But he's basically saying, you know, social progress is actually a good indicator for how well countries are doing, even if they're not doing well economically. So thanks for that, Oleng. Any other thoughts?
You can go ahead, Kehisha.
So 2 points.
Kehisha, we can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Fantastic, yes.
Okay. So on Inke's point, you know, I looked at the video and I realized, you know, we're measuring income and wealth in dollars. And it is a fundamental problem that, one, Western civilization is not necessarily a target for development for African societies, and I don't think it should be. And just like the US dollar should not be the only mean of identifying wealth, because there are other currencies of wealth in Africa, like minerals. The second point on racial, you know, you mentioned the healthier countries are, the richer they get. But now I'm trying to figure out the cause and effect. Is it wealth that creates better health, or is it health that contributes to wealth, or is it vice versa? And I think that's the problem, right? When it's circular, then you've got the poverty cycle that keeps recurring. How do you get out of it, and what do you address first, the problems or the money?
Right, yeah. And it's a fantastic question for any entrepreneur who's serious about changing the landscape of Africa. So let's hear other people's thoughts. I mean, where do you start? Where do you where do you start to get African countries to where they need to be in terms of economic prosperity? And is that the measure we should be using? Is there something fundamentally different that we should be doing? I mean, another point I'll raise that he says in the bigger video is that he actually says we have not seen economic and health improvements anywhere in the world without some level of destruction of the planet. And that just throws in a whole nother curveball, right? So thoughts, what are you guys thinking?
So Strabo, you can unmute and give us your perspective.
Good evening, guys. Very true. So I think one thing that just came to mind now is the effect of age.
Sorry, Strabo, we can't hear you.
Donation.
Sorry, Strabo, sorry, I had to unmute you there. We're really struggling. Do you mind sending your comment as via the group chat, and then we can try again when you raise your hand again at some point. Maybe switch off the video to help you with the Wi-Fi. And then while we wait for Strabo's comment, any other hands? I see Katie's hand here. Katie, you can go ahead.
Yeah, I think maybe just in response to Kahisha, like I know personally, something that people keep saying to me when I face like challenges and stuff is they'll be like, you know, you're still quite young, just like declare insolvency and then start again, because you'll actually only become a real entrepreneur when you're like 35 or 40 years old, you know, and people kind of use that as research. So when she said it, I thought to myself, well, maybe the whole thing of looking at health, you know, is this whole notion of, okay, well, let's not take people seriously when they're young, because I don't know for what reason, you know, or people are so quick to encourage, you know, oh, just kind of kill this idea and move on to the next thing, until you kind of get to this age of 30, 35, 40 years old, where then they say, okay, now you'll only have your $1 million idea, you know, or $1 million idea. So I mean, I don't know, but
we missed the first part of what you're saying, and I think it was fundamental to what you're saying now. Can you go back to the beginning? You said one of the issues that you thought of when Kahisha raised a point was what?
So her point, you know, one of the things she raised was looking at the health versus wealth. You know,
yes.
Why do we focus on health first? And I'm just saying, like, in my personal experience, I know now when I face challenges, you know, people are kind of really quick to say, oh, just kind of, you know, dismiss this, you know, kind of close this business down, because you'll only become a real entrepreneur when you turn like 35 or 40.
Okay.
You know, and I'm just wondering if maybe part of the context that or the part of the attitude that we kind of build into this entrepreneurial journey is that, you know, look, you know, when you're young, you're an entrepreneur, but, you know, you're still kind of working at it. You'll only actually really start succeeding when you get older, which is why maybe in his stats, then you look and you see, okay, now that I've got more, you know, now that people are living longer or people are more healthy, they're able then to come up with these $1 billion ideas, or so it's just something to think about. I don't know how like real it is, but that's just what came into mind when she started speaking about the relation between the two.
So if I'm correct, Katie, are you actually talking about bias, and in this entrepreneurial sense that people assume that age is somewhat correlated to how brilliant your idea is?
The idea will be, yeah, or how successful you'll be at actually carrying out or implementing that idea, you know, to monetize it. Yeah.
Okay. So there's an implicit unconscious bias essentially that people have in, I suppose, putting together this data and filtering it through whatever lens that they use to say, well, here are the facts of the world, essentially.
Yeah. Yeah. True.
Okay, great, great. I like this. Okay.
Sure. So I see some more hands raised. I was just hoping to get some hands raised from voices that we haven't heard from yet. So please raise your hand. But for now, I'll just go to Nkopoleng. Nkopoleng is. Can go ahead, Nkopoleng.
Oh, I thought someone else was up. No? Oh, what I was gonna say is that the question of health is actually quite interesting because it could potentially also have something to do with the type of work that we need to do to get to economic prosperity. So if you think about the big industries in South Africa right now, so you obviously have farming, you have mining, automotive, textile, all of those are actually quite grilling and have quite a lot of harmful effects. Whereas if you compare the West at this point, they've obviously moved far beyond like sort of industrialization and now more into services, and that's how they're creating value. So I don't know at what point do you actually say, like what Keisha was saying, that whole loop of saying, well, are you wealthy because you're healthy, or are you healthy because you're wealthy? And I think this is something I've been thinking about quite a lot recently in terms of like moving forward and thinking about creating work and creating employment. What are we actually looking at as entrepreneurs? You know, is it starting another business in the same industries that sort of perpetuate inequalities and perpetuate all the terrible stuff that history has brought with it? Or are we actually ready to start looking at other avenues? And if we are, what do those look like? Like if you were to start a service business, what does that look like? Are we all going to end up in the finance sector? Yeah, just like a lot of disjointed thoughts on that.
Great, Nkopoleng. That's good. That's good thinking. And let me use that as a segue to move into Dambisa's works, the point that you're making and the point that was made before yours, which is really a question about, you know, bias in information and what are we consuming that is informing the decisions we are making, not only as citizens of the world, but more importantly on this platform as entrepreneurs. What books are we reading? Who are we listening to? Whose voice is dominant in our heads? If there is indeed a science to thinking about entrepreneurship in some ways, and what makes sense for whatever economy you're in, are we reading the right science? And I think this leads us into Dambisa Moyo's argument about dead aid, which I'm sure even if you haven't watched the videos, you've heard about extensively. I mean, what do people think about that? I mean, is aid in any way going to help us as entrepreneurs? Is aid necessary for Africa? Is it no aid at all? Is it some aid? I mean, what thoughts come up for you in the context of this conversation?
I see Keisha's got her right. There we go. Keisha, go ahead.
So I think the idea of aid quite upsets me because the more aid we get, the more dependent we become. And I think we have to look at the nature of or the intent which aid has been coming through in the past. And there's been lots of complaints about, you know, we keep receiving aid. The intention is never to benefit the nations, but to keep oppressing and exploiting the resources that exist. But I think we also need to start questioning our role as Africans in terms of, do we ask for the right aid? When do we manage the aid that comes in? And do we think about programs or sustainable programs to develop beyond the aid? So do we look at aid as an investment, or do we look at it as a charity case or a donation that just needs to exist forever?
Okay, fantastic.
Sure. I'm gonna ask Rachel, if you don't mind, I'm gonna pose this same question to Philile Shongwe, because she's been living in Benin. So it's interesting to figure out what her perspective is, especially having lived in Benin for a while now.
Great.
So Philile, I'm gonna put you on the spot if you don't mind.
Oh gosh. I don't know if my, hello?
Hello, we can
Yes.
hear you.
Oh, okay, great. Yeah, I was wondering if I would be, hi Rachel, by the way.
Hi.
It's just interesting. I just joined the conversation, and I'm very familiar with Dambisa Moyo's arguments versus, you know, aid and its role in Africa. And it's funny because I've sort of been wondering how, you know, the NGO sector is something that I'm currently working in, and being in this world and seeing sort of how even internally we keep asking questions about how are we building capacity whilst also looking for external aid to continue the work that we do as in the nonprofit sector. And I just think that as much as there are arguments that we should look for less dependence, I think more important things is to see how the work as NGO workers, how the work can be more effective, and that will lead to dependence over time. But to simply say these sort of structures that have been working in many of these countries should be removed is possibly not the best way to go about you know, helping where help is needed.
So Pilile,
that's my general.
Sorry, go ahead. I thought you were pausing.
No, I am done, sorry.
Sorry, because I was going to jump in with a question. So are you saying that you think aid actually works in some ways and we shouldn't throw out the baby with the bathwater?
No, what I'm saying is that aid organizations and NGOs should be continually reevaluating, self-reflecting on how much or how they can do better, and eventually seeing ways to be not needed. That's the idea, right? Especially humanitarian aid organizations. There's no doubt about it. These things need to eventually not be needed, and that should be the goal moving forward.
So how do you think about that vis-a-vis what Dambisa Moyo says, which is quite interesting, that, you know, for every $1 that's sent to Africa for aid, in the best case scenario, only 20 cents actually gets to the person they're claiming to help, and that's in the best case scenario. She actually claims for most of Africa, Africans aren't even seeing that aid. So they're actually living their lives despite the aid, even though there's this big story of aid, and that the money is actually going into the pockets of the elite in the government. I mean, and her argument is just that awful stop. I mean, so what are your thoughts?
Right. I think that Dambisa Moyo's argument echoes a lot of the frustration that people that have observed aid coming in for years and not seeing it, you know, meeting the expectations that you know, people expect, I guess. And I think that the sort of recognizing corruption and sort of the systems in which aid is delivered and things like that is part of this reflection that I'm sort of going for, because I think that the intentions are very admirable, and I think that a lot of the people that, even the donors and everyone sort of involved, is looking to do the best in many of these situations. And I think that the worst thing that can happen in the aid sector or in the NGO world is to be complacent to these problems, to keep doing the same thing without seeking to change or seeking to address these problems, because obviously they are better models, but as long as people just stick to what they've been doing for the past 20 years, none of those, you know, good intentions will come to light. That's what I think is a more is a better way, perhaps less angry and frustrated and ready to sort of give up on on things that could potentially do some great work and move people forward.
So a more self-reflective aid that has a sell-by date
Yes.
has a place in Africa, is what you're saying.
That's my personal opinion. Having, you know, someone who's working with these things and sees the value in seeking out to do this work.
Great.
That's
and out of interest, what are you doing in Benin, out of interest?
So currently I work for a research institute as a research assistant. It's called, so this is kind of complicated. So I'm actually doing a Princeton in Africa fellowship, which is a service fellowship.
Okay, got it, okay.
Right, and my post is in a particular research institute in Benin. So that's what I've been doing for the past year or so. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you, Pilile. Thoughts. This is very intriguing, what you just said.
Yeah. I don't know what other people's thoughts are, but that's where I am at this point.
I'm sure we're about to hear lots of them.
I know.
Sure. Thank you so much, Pilile. Richard has a question, a burning question, so I'm gonna unmute him. You can go ahead, Richard.
Hi, can you hear me? Can everyone hear? Hi. So I was just thinking, like, aid agreements are much like good and bad credit agreements, right? So you have like a good loan agreement for an entrepreneur is something that allows the entrepreneur to take out funding where they don't have any funding and still to be able to make a return on that. Whereas similarly, like with aid, a lot of the aid that's given to developing nations could be compared to bad credit agreements, right? The agreement or the aid doesn't allow the developing country much leeway to make a return on that aid. So I think in itself, aid is not a problem. It's more or less the terms that go with it. And I'm just wondering what Rachel's thoughts would be on that.
Okay. Sorry, I missed the last part of your statement because I was just seeing if I've gotten a message from Nkosana. My apologies. So can you say that again, since you're asking for my perspective?
I'm just wondering, in terms of aid agreements, do you think that you could have a good aid agreement where there's still a return to the country giving aid, but as well as the country receiving aid? So you could have a quid pro quo aid agreement almost.
Right. You know, so I'm in more Dambisa Moyo's camp, if I'm to be transparent. I do feel that the problem, I think there's an existential question, which is that, is there such a thing as a good aid agreement? Because at the end of the day, as she says in her arguments, if governments have been tasked to create the kinds of policies that allow for entrepreneurs or businesses or the private sector and even parastatals to thrive within a geography, within a political, then once those governments are beholden to an external party, where in that is there any real benefit for self-actualization? I think the big question is self-actualization. So it's the thing that we always say, for example, the Africa Union, if I remember well, I think 90% of its budget is funded by the EU. And it's kind of ironic. It's because it's like, well, why is a foreign entity funding what is supposed to be the most powerful institution in Africa? It's the same reaction that I had when I went to Ghana and we went to visit the presidential palace. And, you know, they were really thrilled at the fact that it had been built, I think it was by China or India. And the question was, you know, but why? Why is that a point to celebrate? And I think that that's the big question. I think it's a question of self-actualization for me in Africa. But I think Nkosana has arrived.
Yes, I have.
Hi, Nkosana, thank you so much.
My pleasure and my apologies. It's just one of those things. It's a rush hour here. And I had no option but to go to the hospital.
Understand, Nkosana, and thank you so much for making the time to be with us. I had made a brief introduction about who you are, so let me just say something really quickly for the guys who joined just now, and then I'm going to give it to you. And Nkosana, what will happen is we'll give you 20 minutes to just give us an overview of what you think. We've been speaking about the role of aid in Africa's development. We've been speaking about how African countries are doing in relation to other countries. We've also been talking about, in some ways, what does the self-actualization look like in Africa? Whose data are we taking on as a science? Is there bias in that data? I mean, what are some of the things that entrepreneurs should be thinking about in terms of solving African problems? Does social progress come before economic progress? Are they correlated? Are they not? You know, so the kinds of questions that a person like you can answer, Nkosana. But Nkosana currently is the founder and the chairman of the Mandela Institute for Development Studies based in Johannesburg, and does quite a lot of work across Africa in terms of youth empowerment, in terms of election knowledge, specifically in terms of looking at information in Africa, the history of Africa, the kinds of literature that's available for us to consume as citizens of the continent, but also has high-level dialogues with some really important people on the continent who hold powerful positions in terms of how they can influence growth and development on the continent. Before that, he was working in the private equity space. He was also the vice president of the African Development Bank. He was also the minister of, I keep getting this wrong, Nkosana. The minister...
International trade, yeah, industry and international trade.
And international trade, I don't know why I keep saying something else. In Zimbabwe. So he comes with an extreme wealth of knowledge. And Nkosana, I'm going to hand it to you.
Rachel, before I mean, I'm not going to do 20 minutes of a monologue. So what I would propose to do, if you don't mind, is to have a look at my two graphs, because I think a lot of the issues we're going to discuss will stem out of that. So who is the facilitator? If you could just display those graphs and I will explain them so quickly, and then we can move on from there.
Fantastic, thank you. And of course, if you can just, I'm also just going to take myself off the camera so we can just focus on Nkosana. But please give Nkosana the screen. Thank you.
Sure, Dr. Moyo, thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to quickly just pull up the slides that you sent. And then I'll share my screen.
Okay.
No, let him, give Nkosana the screen, because he wants on his laptop so he can doodle with it.
Well, now I hope that we don't get caught up in technology, and let's see whether this will work easily, because I have to sync my fancy pen. Let's see if it works. Here, I think that should do it. So can everybody see this graph then? Just to make sure that I'm not talking to myself and people can't see what I'm talking about.
Sorry, we can't actually see. I thought I could make you the presenter, but it seems I'm limited to making, let's see. Oh, sorry, there we go. There we go. So I've changed
but now I don't have the graphs, so that's a bit of a problem.
So your screen, Nkosana, should be able to now, we should be able to see your screen. So if you have the graph up on your screen, we should be able to see it.
Yes, you just need to press the show screen button somewhere there at the top.
Show screen.
Yes, under the item sharing.
I can't see, let's see, let me guess what, present audio view. You know what, I can't on my screen I've got there's file, whiteboard, and website.
Under file, does it say sharing by any chance, right? Under file?
No, it doesn't.
Okay, so Khotso, he might not have that option. So maybe let's use your.
You know what? As if the audience, if all the other guys can see the graphs, that's fine by me, because clearly I've got them on another iPad. Actually, I can talk to them from that. Are you able to show them rather than me? just manage it also from where you are in terms of displaying the graphs.
Sure, I will just quickly do that on my side.
And all you need to is to tell me which one you're showing it at which time.
Sure, I'm showing, so there's two graphs that you sent, and I'm showing the one with the industrial and digital revolution.
Okay, so can people hear me? I mean, just to make sure all the attendees can understand me and hear me, can they? Can we just get confirmation?
Kahisha, do you mind just quickly saying if you can hear?
We can hear you.
They can hear, can they?
Yes, yes, they can.
Yes, it sounds that way.
Okay, fine. This is a very rough and ready graph I drew this morning. And what I've called this graph is management science, management as a science. And I just want to compare two worlds, if you will. And Southern Africa falls under the lower graph. And what I'll call the first world is the top graph. And all I've done is to show how management as a science is impacted by certain inflection points. So the first inflection point for the upper graph is the Industrial Revolution, then are the two world wars, then the digital revolution. So if we just focus on the top graph for a minute, when the Industrial Revolution took place, whatever the trajectory of countries that were affected was, as far as management as a science was concerned, was impacted and moved onto a different plane, was improved, if you like, for lack of a better expression. And similar, because of the steam engine and the like, and I'm sure you're with me as far as that is concerned, yeah? The impact of Industrial Revolution on management as a science. Then what happened next was the world wars and the incorporation of women into the labor force similarly made the whole art of management or the science of management get better or improve it in terms of how you manage the factors, the input factors of production. Similarly, with the digital revolution, there was an inflection point yet again, and the way the first world managed its resources improved yet again. Are we together so far?
Yes, we are.
Yes, we are.
Now,
sorry, Dr. Moyo, can I just interrupt you for a quick second?
Yeah.
Someone just said that they can't see the graph, so I just want to make sure that everyone can. I want to ask Richard to confirm. Richard, can you see the graph?
No, I can't see the graph. I can see Dr. Moyo though.
Can you see the graph now?
No.
Are you able to? Are you able to try and then show my screen? Let's see whether we can go back to that, if that will work.
So let's try that. Yes, so I've transferred the presentation to you, so you can just go under the sharing option, and then you can.
You know what, Richard? The screen you were showing me actually had share on it. Can you just go back to that screen for me for a minute?
Sorry, which screen?
What you were showing just before now, the screen I was talking to. Go back to it, please.
Let's see.
It says I'm no longer the presenter.
Sorry, okay, I've made you the presenter again.
But you have to go one back, you know, the one I was talking to just now, where I was talking about the graph. Because I could say something, I could see something saying share.
Let's see. So I'm not sure I understand. So I've made you the presenter. So the easiest way to share is the first menu. Sorry, the first drop-down menu under sharing. You can click press play, which is the show screen button.
But it sounds like he doesn't have sharing. I think he's saying, Khotso, on the screen that you had up when you were showing the
Yes, yes, I
You
could.
could see sharing there. So maybe that might work. Maybe try it.
Okay, so what should I do?
So go back to share your screen the way you were sharing it before.
Okay, let's see. So I'll need to make myself the presenter then.
Yes. And then he says he was seeing option for sharing under that. So maybe he can steal the screen from you. I'm not too sure.
Okay, so I'm showing the graph. Rachel, can you see the graph?
I can see the graph.
Okay. Can somebody else confirm in the audience that they can see the graph?
So I'm now a part of the audience, that's correct, yeah?
Yes.
I can see the graph. And above the graph on my screen, there is share, zoom, slideshow, draw, edit, and rotate. Is that any use?
Oh.
Yes.
No, that's for the image, right, Khotso, on your screen. That won't allow him to. Yeah.
So it won't allow me to do anything with it?
No. Can everybody else see though, Khotso? Can we try that experiment again?
Sure. I'm going to ask if Tom, do you mind just confirming if you can see this, the graph?
So I can see the graph. I'm able to switch between the graph and Dr. Moyo's webcam. So everyone must just check if they can switch. There should be an option where you can switch what you're seeing.
Ah.
Thank you for that, Tom. Great, Dr. Moyo, I think you can continue. And sorry, just one question from Daniel before we continue.
Yeah.
Daniel, you can go ahead. He hasn't said anything. You can continue, Dr. Moyo.
Incidentally, if people can see me, can they see the small iPad I'm holding?
Yes.
Because then that's another way of trying to do this, okay?
So bring it closer to the screen and then tilt it over forward.
Over forward. Can you see it?
Much better. And just bring it closer to the. Move your hand down, Nkosana, and then closer to.
I can't hold it. That's my problem.
Oh, there you go. No, right there. And then just move it closer to the screen. There you go.
Okay, guys. So can everybody see this? The first graph I was talking about is the top one there. So, industrial revolution, management as a science or as an art gets kicked upwards. Similarly, the world wars incorporating women in the workforce. And lastly, the digital revolution, if you like. Are we together there? Yes. Okay. Now, when we come to the lower graph, things get really exciting, I think. So when you look at South, is everybody on this a South African? Are the participants South Africans?
Yes, most of them. Yes, most participants will be South African.
No, but I need to know if there is there anybody who is not a South African?
Oh, sure. Please raise your hand if you are not South African. Kihisha?
I can't hear.
Kihisha, we can't hear you.
I am speaking from Guadeloupe, the Caribbean islands.
Okay, so you'll have to bear with me. I'll try and explain in a way which makes sense. So, in Southern Africa, if you take Zimbabwe and South Africa specifically, the impact of, let me call it colonization generally, is what I'm going to refer to when I now look at the lower graph, this lower graph, yeah? Mm-hmm. When these two countries, before colonization, were doing their own thing, they had their own management trajectory. And then their first inflection point was colonization, which is what is that crossover point. Can you see it?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And at that point, on the face of things, the way our institutions worked was given a fill up, if you like. They were kicked upwards, became more efficient because they started mimicking the management art of the colonizer. So our institutions began to mimic these institutions on the first graph after colonization. But notice I've drawn another line which is going downwards. And that line is the capacity of indigenous people to run anything. Because what happened was similar to the indigenous people being in the cockpit of a plane and suddenly at colonization being kicked out of the cockpit and being made passengers rather than pilots. So you will understand that their capacity or ability to fly that aeroplane clearly yet to deteriorate with time, yes?
Mm-hmm.
So the graph in terms of capacity to manage would go down. And the next inflection point became the point of independence. The point where I put point number 2. And this is where problems start happening. So the colonizer gets kicked out and taken out of managing our institutions, and we give the management responsibility to locals whose capacity has deteriorated quite significantly, and therefore the functioning of institutions takes a dive, as you'd expect, purely scientifically, no emotions involved here, just observing as a scientist. Are we agreed?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah? It's important before we go back to this issue of history and colonization and age and so on and so on. Let me just stop there and make sure people follow what I've just been saying.
Okay.
Sure, and I think Pilile had a quick question. Pilile, do you mind? And let's please keep it brief.
Asked if everyone was South African, but since this is all relevant to Southern Africa, we can move on.
And where is Pilile from?
I'm from Swaziland, sir.
But I mean, Swaziland is next door, so you can understand what I'm discussing, because when I was preparing,
yes.
Yeah, okay, fine, that's fine. So can we go to the second graph before we then have a conversation?
Yes, please go ahead.
Can
Now,
everyone see the second graph?
Can you see the second graph?
Yes.
This graph, what I've called E or stroke D, is evolution or development. And the other axis is just time. And what I've drawn here is a very stylized version of different countries, i.e. country 1, 2, 3, and 4, and their evolution from the origin, which I've called primitive man down here, and the graphs, country 1, 2, 3, and 4, and the different evolution paths that they take. So if we take any African country, it will not be, if the developed world is along, like represented by country 1, then we can all agree that developing countries will not be on that graph. It will be either C2, 3, or 4. Are we together?
Yes.
Okay. But if we take, therefore, a point in time, the line that I've drawn, you will then notice that in terms of institutions, which are always a result of the journey that any society has traveled to date, so institutions that are in country 1 at that point, those institutions do the best to reflect the journey that this society has traveled. And similarly, the institutions here reflect the journey that countries represented by country 2 have traveled, and so on as we go down. The biggest challenge, I think, that we have today is that countries that are represented by country 1, the developed world, try to impose their way of doing things on everybody else. Yet, everybody else has not traveled the journey that countries represented by C1 have traveled. It doesn't matter what it is. It could be the constitution, it could be the way financial institutions work, name it, it will still conform to what I've just said. Are we together?
Yes.
Okay. But notice something else that I've done here. If you take a particular society, let's say country 1, at that point, the crossover point is an average. Even within that society, there will be people who are above the average and other people who are below the average. And often, if you take trajectories that are next to each other, there will be an overlap at the top end of the bottom country and the bottom end of the top country. Are we together again there?
Mm-hmm.
The people on this webinar, although we all live in countries below country 1, say country represented by country 3 or 2, it doesn't matter.
Mm-hmm.
The overlap makes us a bit of a problem people, because although we live in the lower society, we've been socialized through education, travel, and just general exposure to actually be more comfortable in the institutions of countries represented by country 1, not our own societies. And because we are the elites and we tend to run our countries, we've made our institutions non-accessible by our own people. Again, are we together?
Yes.
You know, I can only, was that Rachel? I'm much more interested in the others, not you, Rachel.
The only reason, Nkosana, I keep saying yes is because what we do is we mute everybody else, because if you let everybody on, you have all sorts of sounds filtering in. But maybe, Khotso, let's just check if there are a few people who want to say yay or nay. Are they with Nkosana?
Sure. Kahisha, I remember you had a specific question. You weren't clear on something, so I'm going to unmute you. Go ahead.
So when we're done with this graph, can we just go back to graph 1, point number 1? So I understood point number 2 about independence and the transfer, I guess, of knowledge not being done from the colonizer to the colonized. But the point number 1 on that graph, we weren't sure exactly what it signified.
The point number 1 was the point of colonization.
Oh.
So at the point of colonization, our administrations were taken over by the colonizer, and the functioning of our institutions began to mimic the institutions where the colonizer had come from. So they started, the functioning started mimicking and approaching, therefore, call it efficiency or whatever, of the origins of the colonizer. Are we together? So that's the upper line. From point number 1, there is 2 lines, one which goes upwards, flex upwards, and the other one which flex downwards, yeah? I don't hear any response anymore.
Khotso, do you want to put Kahisha on so that she can respond if she's understanding?
Yeah, Kahisha can go ahead, yes.
Yeah, now I get it. Thank you.
Now you get it. So the lower line, the line that's going downwards, is our capacity as indigenous people to manage, because we've become passengers from this point on. Our institutions appear to be performing almost like to world standards, but that's because now they're being managed by people who came from the colonizing space with higher evolved institutions or the art of management. And let me just complete, and then when we come to point number 2, which is independence, we then get a downward sloping performance of institutions, because we, the indigenous people with lower capacity because we've been made passengers, are now piloting the plane, And not surprised, we can't fly it, so we fly it into the ground. Yes?
Aisha?
Okay, can I repeat so I can try to understand? So at point 1, the colonizer was growing the country, and that's why the curve was going upwards.
Yes.
And then there was an inflection point.
But our capacity to manage now starts going downwards because we've been made passengers, right?
Okay. And then that curve up there is the colonizer that carries on and up to the point of independence.
Yes. And at the point of independence, we kick them off from managing our institutions and we take them over. But guess what? We've forgotten how to fly, haven't we?
So what happens to us?
We are now flying in the cockpit, but we're flying our institutions into the ground.
Sure. I'm actually going to ask us maybe to move on, and then at the point, yeah.
So okay, so I think I would like to use that as a backdrop, Rachel. What you want me to discuss the issue of aid?
Yes, and I think Nkosana maybe explain, because I don't think what you're saying, and I think sometimes that can be the misinterpretation of these graphs. And I think you explained it well through your boiling water, small cup of boiling water versus large lake illustration. I think give that illustration, and then let's use that as a segue to have a discussion around, well, what does this all mean for entrepreneurs?
Okay, no, that's fine. Again, unfortunately, I'm going to use Southern Africa, Zimbabwe, and South Africa as illustrations of this point. At the point of before independence for these two countries, we had two countries in one. Everybody agree with that, yeah? We had two societies which were living literally separately, and the black country was like a lake full of cold water. Its economy, its institutions, in fact, were set up to be second-class kind of institutions. The first world economy was the white country, which was like a small cup of water full of boiling, a small cup full of boiling water, using the temperature of water as a surrogate for the higher temperature it is, the better performance we get out of the system. But also note that with a situation like a heat exchanger, the lake had a one-way heat flow system. The heat was taken from the big mass of water to keep the small container warm, and that heat could not go backwards. It was a one-way flow system. And at the point of independence, what we did was to mix the two systems together. And the point here to note is the baseline. So as we mix the two systems together, the resultant attributes of the new body of water, the combined systems, is clearly the characteristics of the bigger mass of water. But virtually in every single case, our behavior and promises were such that we made people expect that the bigger system would actually attain the characteristics of the smaller body of water from day one. So as 94 arrived in South Africa, the black community expected to live lives like what the whites were living before. Similarly in Zimbabwe. But you will understand from basic science that what we should have been doing is tell everybody that the new system, our starting point was the less developed system, because it literally swamped what was a better system. The hot water became cold, essentially. And the combined system had to have the characteristics of the bigger mass of water. I hope that analogy is not too confusing.
So Nkosana,
Sorry, go ahead, Rachel.
I was going to say, so what I'm hearing from you, Nkosana, is basically we have a situation where two countries are coexisting. One that has been inundated essentially with resources, whether it's labor development, whether it's education. You have a system that has the much better resource allocation. And then you have a system that has been set up, like you said, to be a second-class system. And that the problem at independence was an assumption that when we merge the two systems, the one that has been basically void of resources will automatically become like the one that has been inundated with resources, when in fact it's the opposite. And so all the policies that we've put in place actually don't speak to the reality of where Africa really was at independence, and that's perhaps why we've been failing the way we've been failing as a continent.
Yes, because remember, in the fight, part of the problem was that in the fight for freedom or independence, the leadership motivated people to believe that at the point that inclusion happened, their quality of life would improve to mimic that of the better community, better in terms of quality of life, which was white at that point. And then nobody was scientific about it to say, actually, no. What will happen, what will actually change is access to opportunities as opposed to immediate improvement in the quality of life, yeah? And part of the problem, for instance, with fees must fall, and I hope that this doesn't get out of control in terms of emotiveness, is that people are looking at the wrong thing. In other words, we are ignoring the reality of the baseline. Where am I starting from? And realistically, what can I achieve, and in what time frame, and how much resources to go into that system to improve it even marginally on the trajectory to catching up with what was the erstwhile white system. That analysis has not happened at a scientific level. It's been full of emotion and not a scientific analysis.
So Nkosana, is this what has then given a vacuum space for aid? Because if we're not thinking about it scientifically, it gives room for someone to say, we'll think for you. We'll tell you what you should be doing.
Partly, but the problem then that arises immediately is, you know, the expression, teach somebody to fish rather than feeding them fish. Aid is like feeding somebody, giving somebody fish rather than teaching them to fish for themselves. Yeah. So in other words, we are starting from a flawed system, and essentially the interventions that come through aid are perpetuating the flawed system as opposed to helping the underprivileged, erstwhile underprivileged, to catch up over time, to acquire ways of doing things for themselves and improving their circumstance, because now the system is not rigged against them.
Great. Shall we open it up to questions? Because then people can have the specific questions they had answered by Nkosana.
And please raise your hands and then I'll unmute you.
I'm not hearing.
Don't see any. Sorry, yes, I don't see any hands raised. Does anyone have a question? Please raise your hands. Or if you do not know how to raise your hand, please post the question in the group chat.
Mm.
Okay, Rachel, Bandile's got a question. I'm going to unmute. Bandile, go ahead.
Hi.
Hi, Bandile.
My question is around what you were saying about the overlaps, and what it and what it would take for people, what you might crudely call the intelligentsia, to be involved. And I'm asking actually more of a psychological question, a question about habits and about, you know, from a day-to-day perspective, what it would take for the, you know, the skilled classes slash the intelligent classes slash, you know, those that we require to update and to fly the plane. What does it take for them to be engaged in what you might say is a patriotic project? So briefly, in 30 seconds, what the backstory is something like in a previous conversation I was having sort of yesterday, the comments of one of my former professors, Chris Malikane, who is now the advisor to the South African finance minister, you know, talking about, you know, you need professionals, but you have the one side of the professionals, or rather you have black professionals who are not engaged in a patriotic project, but then you have quote unquote tender-based professionals who are, but you know, it's the problem that arises that all our previous predecessors in the development game, be it like first world countries or the more advanced developing countries, your China or your Japan, sort of got it done, or your Singapore, got it done through a forced top-down authoritarian patriotism. I don't know if that's clear. And then
I think I understand what you're saying, but
yeah. So then the question is, what does it take then for when we say the people flying the plane? How do you get them on board into a patriotic project where they'd have to suffer, where they'd sacrifice their own material gains for the greater good, but if you don't have quote unquote authoritarianism available to you?
Well, so let me firstly, let me push back on your use of the word patriotic and suggest to you a slightly different formulation, and that is enlightened selfishness. You see, part of the challenge that I think people like yourselves need to really understand is leaders today, but more importantly, leaders of tomorrow, is that everything that you are going to make for yourselves is at risk from the masses that have got nothing. Because you're going to have an animal farm kind of situation where the elites have taken over from the colonizer. But instead of changing the welfare of a larger mass of people, they have simply replaced the role played by yesterday's colonizer. But what will surely follow from that is that the bulk of society will soon enough begin to say, this system is not working for me. And they can destroy the total system without losing anything. And you, the elites, we, the elites, you've got everything to lose. So instead of using the word patriotism, actually understand this as enlightened selfishness, self-preservation. The only way you're going to protect what you have is to create more people with something to lose. That's point number one. Point number two, you need to understand that the biggest resource that any society has is its people, not minerals, but its people. And countries like Japan prove this time and time. Singapore, Japan, these sort of countries have proved that if you educate your people and understand that they are your best resource, development is then easier to tackle. But if you rely on natural resources, we've got a countless number of other countries to show for this. Countries with oil, countries with hydrocarbons generally, solid minerals like South Africa, where the elites fail to understand that improving the lot of everybody else actually is the best insurance you have. Both insurance, but also the best trampoline you have to jump off in terms of development. So I hope I've shifted your emphasis away from patriotism, which sounds very idealistic to something that is much more practical and that's appealing to human being selfishness, but just turning it into an enlightened and smart selfishness, which means create a bigger cake, share it with more people, and then they protect the system. If they've got nothing to lose, they will destroy the system.
So, Dr. Moyo, I have another question from Sichaba for you.
Yeah.
He sent this in the group chat. He said, and I quote, Dr. Moyo, what do you think ought to characterize the third inflection point that will set African institution management capacity back on an upward trajectory? So I think he was talking about graph 1.
Graph 1.
Great question.
So that graph, and again, let me see, I hope people can see it on my smaller iPad. Can you?
Yes.
You see, once you've understood this graph scientifically, at this transition point, what we should have done was not just to take these people with who have forgotten how to fly a plane and put them in the cockpit. We should have taken them to training school en masse, and then as they acquire the skills, put them here. And what would have happened then is that the graph would have continued. At least it might have gone flat, but it would have not. It wouldn't have gone starting to like fly the plane into the ground. We should have just understood and been patient and trained our people before we gave them the responsibility. That's all.
So is that what we're doing right now to drive us back upwards?
Absolutely. I think we need to train more, to pay attention to our education systems, make the education systems more appropriate for our circumstances, and train people in large numbers for whatever we want to be done.
Super. Thank you. I'm going to unmute Richard. Richard, you can go ahead.
Hi, Dr. Moyo. I have a follow-up question from your point regarding the elites and how the elites, the best way of securing what the elite has would be to ensure that other people's quality is also improving. So you're improving the rest of society as you go along. I'm not sure if I'm understanding that point correctly. But my question is, in terms of time, is there not a time difference between that? So you almost, as an elite, you want to first create enough distance between yourself and the class directly below you before you help improve that class. So you want to always ensure that there's kind of like a fence between you and that other class. So while the other class is improving, they're still behind. They're not on the same level as you.
That's an interesting way of putting it. So the question, the challenge then that you have is, how do you create distance which is not, which stays inspirational rather than becomes discouraging? In other words, when there is, if let's say I am in doing matric, I can see the possibility of going to university. But if I'm not even allowed, or I don't see the possibility of going to school and going to do my matric and going to university, then I begin to perceive that I cannot aspire to go to university. It's beyond my reach to do that. I can't even dream of it. So you have to be very careful about the distance you create between yourself and those following behind, for that distance to be motivational and to create aspirations, as opposed to them beginning to say, this system is not meant for me, I'm not part of it, it excludes me, it doesn't let me in, I'm an outsider. Once that happens, then they destroy it. But when they feel that the system allows them to attain what you've attained, and they can look up to you and say, Richard is there, I can also get there if I work hard enough, then it inspires them, and it will stay inspirational rather than becoming discouragement. Yeah.
Thank you. Before I jump back to the questions in the group chat, I want to give Nkopoleng a chance. Nkopoleng, you can go ahead and ask.
Hi, I just have two very quick questions. So the first one is, do you have any hope for sustainable growth, equality, and justice within the constraints of capitalism? And I just want to use the American dream as an example, that a few years ago it was global, and a lot of people actually were pulled out of poverty because of this dream. But at the same time, it's led to a lot of disparity and actually a lot of death. So within the constraints of how things are today, do you actually see hope for equality and justice, or do we need to change the entire system? And then the second one is related to what you just spoke about now. I don't know, I have a problem with sort of using privilege to drive change, like still operating under the I don't know, the sort of like the idea that you can still have an elite class and then have those people pull up other people, because essentially, like you said, people are selfish. Like, when do you decide that, okay, now I have enough to be able to help people? And also, elitism by its nature means that you are trampling on other people. So to me, it just it doesn't make any sense. It's like you can't have.
Did we just lose Nkopoleng?
No, I'm done. Thanks.
Okay, so I think you are mixing your terms rather loosely, if I may say so. You are using justice and equality as if they are interchangeable. But of course they are not. Justice is one thing and we should aspire towards it. But what does equality mean? You know, let me take something. I like to run. That's how I keep fit. But I know I would never be good enough to go to the Olympics to run as a runner. So should I be asking for equality in terms of performance in sport, for instance? What is equality? You need to help me to understand what that is. Secondly, you've used capitalism in a very generalized way, as opposed to acknowledging that the way capitalism is practiced actually is very broad. I think the US is at one extreme, and if you come even to continental Europe, countries like France, Germany are somewhere, maybe somewhere in the middle. And then if you go to Scandinavian countries, social democratic countries practicing capitalism, they've got much more equity, not equality, in the way they treat their citizens. So I think capitalism can be practiced in many different ways and have different results. The US being an extreme where it's almost like Darwinian survival of the fittest kind of thing, yeah? And then you implied that when I was talking about aspiration and so on, I'm using privilege to inspire people. I am not using, I'm using access and different capacity, like I've used in athletics, for instance, to allow people to find their own level, but for people to feel that it is possible for them to change their circumstances, as opposed to feeling that the system is loaded against them. In other words, there is no justice in the system. If there is no justice in the system, you absolutely are going to get a revolution. But if people perceive justice, they are much more likely to accept their own different level determined by their capacity to do whatever it is, whether it's athletics or lifting weights, whatever the case may be, academic performance. I find my own level in a just system. Nkopoleng, do you follow what I'm trying to push back on?
Sure, Nkopoleng. If you don't mind commenting.
Yeah, I do follow, absolutely. And I think you make a valid point with regards to equality versus equity, or is it fairness? Yeah, but essentially the fact that you're not necessarily striving for complete equality. But I still do think that we kind of need to be careful about, I don't know how to put it, but the idea that a certain different classes can exist and that we can have huge disparities between those classes. So I think Scandinavia is a great example, because even poor people in Scandinavia are, by international standards, actually quite well off. So in that case, it makes more sense to have people who are slightly richer or who have more resources and so on, because the basic needs of most people have been met. Whereas in the context of South Africa and other African countries, we're starting from a level where, like, literally people are dying because they don't have access to medication or food. And so although models like Scandinavian countries do make sense, like, our context is quite different, and the disparity between the haves and the have-nots is still quite large.
No, that's absolutely correct. All I'm seeking for you to be careful about is don't use the concept of equality and confuse it with equity or justice. And similarly, don't use a broad paintbrush to condemn capitalism, because you can see that different practices of capitalism can achieve very different outcomes. So that's really all I would like us to take away from there, those 2 points, yeah? But also that different levels of achievement can be used to inspire people, to make them aspire to achieve, as opposed to making them feel that the system is loaded against them. So, and that is not privilege, it's just different capacity.
Super. So we've got 10 minutes left on the webinar. I was just wondering, Rachel, how do you want to proceed? How many more questions do you think we should take?
I think we have room for 2 more questions, Kotso.
Sure.
Yeah.
Cool. I'm going to ask Keisha a question, so I'm going to unmute her and then jump to Bandile. But also, if there's anyone who hasn't spoken yet, it would be great to hear a perspective from a different voice as well. So please raise your hand now, and I'll prioritize you just to give you a chance. Okay, I am going to Keisha now. Keisha, you can go ahead. Okay, I'm going to ask Tom. Tom, you can go ahead.
Hi, Dr. Moyo. I've got a question for you regarding development of African countries. My question is, do African countries need to follow the same development path that other countries have gone through? If we're starting at different places, is it necessary for us to move through all the stages of development, from going through a manufacturing industry into a service industry, or is it possible for us to leapfrog to almost catch up with other countries' developments?
Okay, very good question. The first point to recognize is that there is a psychological problem, firstly. Psychologically, we've been set up to believe, we've been socialized to believe that everything about what we call developed countries is good, and everything about developing countries is inferior to everything in developed countries, which, if you notice, just take the area of environmental management. Actually, what we call developing countries tend to have superior ways of managing the environment compared to developed countries. So let's just make sure, before I even get to the issue of follow the same path, yeah, that we are waking up to the fact that developed does not necessarily mean better in all respects. that the so-called developed countries are behind developing countries in some elements or some aspects. Okay? Secondly, it's absolutely unnecessary for developing countries to follow exactly the same stages. You know, because of the digital age technology, many examples of leapfrogging that are now possible. The simplest illustration being telephony, where the highest levels of cell phone or wireless communication technologies is in fact countries that were coming behind wired or what we call landline telecoms. We didn't need to go through all that pain and stringing wires across countries in order to catch up with access to telecommunications. Just use technology to leapfrog and catch up, or even in terms of levels of penetration, actually go ahead of these so-called developed societies. So I would imagine that there will be many other examples where we can do the same, i.e. take, if you like, shortcuts, leapfrog, and sometimes actually get the advanced societies to come back to us in certain elements of how we live with nature around us and with each other. Okay?
Super.
I don't know whether Tom can
just
hear me.
Before we
Tom.
go to, oh, sorry, is that Tom? Mm-hmm.
Oh, great. That answered my question. Thank you very much.
And before we go to the next person, Nkosana, Tom earlier had a question around the comment that you made in the video, in the interview we had, about elections, that the problem with campaigns is that they allow certain characters to dominate the space who are not necessarily the right characters for leadership, and that people should actually choose their leaders. And his question was, what does that mean on a national, on a grand national platform versus like a community platform, for example? So if you're running for president, what does that look like in real life?
I have to say it's a valid question, and I'm not sure that I've got an answer for it. But I suspect that as you get different layers of what I would call, starting from society leadership, the visibility of these people allows a society on the whole to make choices before these people even go to campaign. I'm not sure whether, if Tom is South African, let me just use, without naming names, in the current crop of leaders and people in parliament, I'm sure that if South Africans were asked, without any campaign whatsoever, to make some informed choice of who should be the next head of state, they would actually have a pretty good go at it. But if you go through a campaigning process, more often than not, a different individual will come through. Yeah? So I think just the visibility of leaders as they are, because they are playing different roles, starting from local societies through districts and provinces and so on, they become more visible to the whole country, and that visibility allows the community or the population of the country to choose without a campaign.
Great.
Thank you. Sure, Rachel. With just 2 minutes left, I think now would be a good time to wrap up.
Right. Well, Nkosana, I think I would love for you to wrap up, because a question I have is, based on everything that we've said, what is the role of the entrepreneur in Africa with the context of aid, of management systems that have lagged for a while, with this question of equity versus equality versus access? What do you think a responsible entrepreneur should be thinking about?
Well, Rachel, allow me to remove responsible, because that's a completely different discussion, yeah?
Okay. Can you answer both then? Can you do without responsible and then with responsible?
So let me tell you my observation again about my part of the world, which is Southern Africa. It's fascinating, actually. I go back to my issue about two societies in one country or two countries in one. The definition of a market in pre-94 South Africa and the pre-80 Zimbabwe was essentially the white community market. And the black market, which was larger, or the black community, which was larger in terms of potential for satisfying their needs, was essentially asked to tag along. And what fascinates me is that our entrepreneurs, when we get to the point of transition, continue with a mindset which does not see the opportunities that lie in the bigger market. They continue to target the smaller market in terms of trying to see what products and needs they can satisfy, and the larger market is a tag along. So I think these opportunities in the space we are now in lie in shifting emphasis and focus to the larger market and looking at how to look at ways of both packaging and developing products and satisfying needs of this larger pool, rather than continuing to consider the larger market as a tag-along market. So, yeah, I think that would be a major psychological shift, which makes people begin to look for opportunities where they really exist, as opposed to a very artificially defined market that comes from our history.
And in your travels across Africa, Nkosana, is there an entrepreneur or entrepreneurs that you can cite as doing this well, who've understood the local market?
So in the financial services sector, I would urge most people on this webinar to take some time and understand the story of Equity Bank in Kenya. It's a fascinating story, because Equity Bank broke out of this particular framework of looking always at the elites and the very small and confined market as the market, and started banking the unbanked, and everybody in finance at the time said they were going to lose their shares because it could not be done. But Equity Bank has gone through a period which is over 10 years at double-digit growth rates, because it came up with a formulation of access to financial services which was targeted at the larger, formally unbanked market. Equity Bank in Kenya is a good example. Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, Nkosana, we never have enough time with you. But we try to be true to the time here. So we're going to have to close off, unfortunately. I hope that everybody had a chance to ask their question. I hope that everybody feels like they have a better understanding of the historical trajectory that the continent has taken and how we can be much more scientific in our approach. I think, Nkosana, if I draw from what you said earlier when you highlighted the fees must fall, and then you talked about being scientific about the approach to what policies are needed for where we really are. I think the responsible entrepreneur, and I think even the responsible citizen, to the point I was driving earlier, I think it's a conversation that requires really level-headed thinking versus emotional, being driven by emotion, and being driven by, I suppose, vendettas versus what is it that really our continent needs right now in terms of a level-headed thinking. And I think that's the message I will leave the group with, but also the message of hope. I think when you talked about people need to feel like they can aspire to something and actually change their circumstances, I think that hope then becomes an important element of how we drive messages, even do entrepreneurship across the continent, create a system in which people can feel like they can have access. And I think we'll start to see ourselves move up much faster.
I would agree with that summary, Rachel. And maybe the only last thing I would add, which sounds like an oxymoron sometimes, is that even if you're going to be selfish, be smart about it. Don't self-destruct in the process.
Absolutely. Absolutely agree. Yeah. Thank you so much, Nkosana. We really appreciate your time and for you rushing. I know you, like you said, you had a medical emergency, but thank you so much for making the time to be with us. I wish we had time for a checkout, but I'm just cognizant that some people may need to rush off. Can I just ask for 30 seconds if people can put up their hands if they just want to check out, so that those who want to can stay on and check out, those who need to leave can go. Khoso, you can help me manage that a little bit.
Cool. Or maybe just to make it easier potentially, if we could have a checkout statement from say 2 people, briefly 20 seconds, and if they can put up their hands.
Great. And maybe check out by telling us what your key takeaway from this conversation is.
I'm going to go with Bandile since he had his hand up for a while. Bandile, you can go ahead.
No, sorry, it was still up from earlier, so I don't have a close-off statement really, but just.
Okay.
Hello?
Hi, we can hear you.
Yeah, so my hand was up from earlier. I was gonna ask a question, but so I don't really have a close-off statement of any sort here.
Okay. Okay, thank you, Bandile. Was your question answered though, when you wanted to ask a question?
Yeah. It was covered by Tom's question actually, so that was
Good.
that was right.
Okay, great. Anyone else with a closing statement or key takeaway?
No hands at this point, so I think we might as well close off.
Okay, fantastic. Well, thank you again, guys. So we'll see you in the next session, where we'll be talking about the future of global growth, society, and business. So we look forward to having